Alright, so now we're going to do another of these Stephen King book versus movie things. The first two we've done this month were Dreamcatcher and Thinner, and a lot of those were how exactly can this translate and how was that going to go, and the way that the movies sometimes had to like clumsily go about it and take certain liberties, and they both just kind of ended up pretty messy in their own ways. This one should be much easier to talk about because this is one where it works both ways. So, as far as like being. There's certain elements in the book that you can't really translate, but the movie took those and kind of did it in its own way, and everything sort of comes together, and there is basically a perfect book version and a perfect movie version of this story. So, with all of that working together, I suppose we can talk about how, just right away, both of them start. It's interesting that even though, by movie standards, Misery's movie pretty much starts right away, with kind of establishing just really quickly who Paul Sheldon is and what his books are, and then him going out driving and crashing before Annie finds him. And that actually seems like a lot of build-up, even though it's only like 3 to 5 minutes of movie. Because the book is pretty much instantaneous. He's like already wrecked when the book starts, and then everything else is just kind of like him kind of trying to remember how he got to this place. It's hard to even call it a flashback. It's sort of more like his mind kind of swirling after the wreck, that kind of gives us the background in the book. But both of them feel like they just start right away and put him immediately in this position. And what else is interesting about that is once he is in the house and he's in the bed and he's being cared for, one thing I love especially is apparently Kathy Bates was kind of an out of left field choice at the time because she really wasn't known. And they were looking like at all these different sort of big names, but once you, I don't know if it's because she's so iconic in this part now, but when you go back and you read the book, even the physical description sounds pretty much exactly like what Bates looked like on screen. And then when you take that into account and like everything is coming to life in this really vivid way, you get these things like how far into it is he going to realize he's in danger? And normally, once again, we're kind of playing up the opposite of what you might think. In the book, it feels like it happens pretty quickly. Like it does not take long at all for him to realize he's in danger. And normally in a book you would think, because a book is thicker and longer and has more detail, that it would take sort of longer to get to that point. But once again, the book just gets right to it very quickly, where it's like he's been in the wreck, he gets saved in quotes, and then it's not long at all before he realizes he's in danger. The movie gets to play with that a little bit, and thus Bates gets to play with that a little bit in the role also, where it's like we get these moments where, especially if you're going into like the story blind, we'll say, you get this vibe of, oh, she is just a nurse, and oh, this is just a great stroke of luck. Where is this story going to go from here? But it does almost seem like it's almost too lucky that he gets found by his number one fan, who also happens to be a nurse, and they just happen to be in this same area. But they do establish well enough, and she establishes well enough, that at first this might not be a threatening character. But there's even moments that you don't even really realize until you've really like looked the performance over, like when she talks about the phone lines being down, which she's clearly lying about. You can see where she goes from smiling when she's trying to be really hospitable and friendly and make Paul think that she's trustworthy, but then you get these moments where she's lying about the phone lines and she just kind of goes straight face. Like, it's not something that's overly telling, but when you know to look for it, you can see the expression changes and how the life sort of leaves her when she has to lie about a situation to make sure that he stays here. And the way that she can just kind of go in and out of it, to the point that it's believable at first that movie Paul, doesn't really notice at first. And it's not until we get to, like, the soup scene that it kind of starts to take a turn, and it's like, oh, this person is actually unhinged, and maybe even more than that. Because, and talking about that also, there's a great moment in the book where King describes, through Paul, that listening to Annie speak is like listening to a song that's in the wrong key. And so when you take that and you realize just this sort of wavering line that she's at, and you're not sure which direction it's going to go, and there's things that would normally just be something you wouldn't think about too much, or something that you would just take as like a quirky personality trait or something. The way she makes her own vocabulary so she doesn't have to swear, because like a character like completely altering her vocabulary to sound more polite actually makes her significantly creepier and more memorable in this horrifying way. Is such an interesting concept for the character. But another thing about the feeling of being trapped with this character is something that it might seem like is a misstep that the movie takes, but this is what I was talking about, where I was saying that they definitely work on their own merits in their way that they told the story in regards to telling the story from a book's perspective versus a movie audience's perspective. Because, like I said, the flashbacks are really just kind of like, the leftovers of his mind after he's crashed. And that never really makes us feel like we've left the current events when they happen in the book. So when you look at it that way, we pretty much never leave the house when we're in the book. Once he first gets there to when he's rescued at the end, because we do have the epilogue where he's out of the house, but everything in between, it feels like we, the reader, are in just as much of the hostage situation as he is, and we never see we never see things past Paul's perspective in the book while he's in the house. And I really, really love that. And I do think there is a very effective movie to be had if you took that approach cinematically. But the movie does do this thing that does end up working, where we are seeing the outside factors going in, where we are seeing people find his car and, are looking into him, and his agents calling and looking for him. And we're watching this through Richard Farnsworth and Frances Sarandon's characters, this sort of cute old married couple that's like, this law enforcement officer and his deputy, who also just happen to be husband and wife. And the idea of that being this... He sort of ends up being like a Halloran character, where we kind of follow him and follow him and follow him, and it seems like pretty much we're only leading to his ultimate death. And the fact that they sort of used that in place of these moments where in the book there are like there's a cop that shows up that Annie ultimately kills in a very over-the-top way. She stabs him repeatedly with a wooden cross and then runs his head over with a riding mower and then disposes of his body, and then kind of waits around, and then two more cops show up, and then people show up that know her as the Dragon Lady and know her past. They kind of start to harass her. So it's like there's always these elements sort of coming in once the first cop comes in the book. But when you take in the element of the Farnsworth character is the only one that shows up, and they're kind of able to work all of that into, everything that happens with all those different characters that come in, and kind of shape that down into one or two characters here. It doesn't feel like it never takes away from the suspense of how captive Paul feels. Anytime we go right back into him in the room, our minds go right back into that feeling. So it never really risks the breaking of that tension by showing us the outside characters. And that was something that was probably pretty tricky to pull off when they were adapting it. When William Goldman adapted the screenplay, and of course Reiner directing. That's something where I'm really pleased how that turned out. Because if you had told me beforehand that that's what they ended up doing, I would have probably immediately turned my nose up at it and would have been like, no, you have to keep the sort of first-person perspective of never leaving the house. But the movie definitely found a way to make that work, I think. And so, yeah, when you talk about the amping up of the tensions, you have like we're building up exactly how dangerous Annie is as it goes on, where it seems like it's always escalating very quickly. But we do have the sort of stepping stones up to this point, like the soup scene, where it's that moment when in the book that's where she mentions being on the stand in Denver, and it's like it's in this sort of rage-filled place that she does it, and that kind of opens up a door immediately of okay, now the viewer immediately wants to know like okay, now what does that mean and where does this go and what's the mystery of this character. I thought the movie almost did that in a more effective way, where she is in a happy state and willingly gives up the information. Yeah, I was on the stand in Denver for this thing, and it's after that scene has happened, and that's something where it's like it really shows the sort of unpredictability of the character, which is the whole sort of basis of the fear of this concept in this story. Um, but there's also like the idea of having Paul's internalized thoughts, where it's because there's clearly moments in the movie where it turns from uncertainty to oh this might be a pretty tense thriller to oh this is a horror movie. In the movie it's the moment when he wakes up after she's read the last Misery book and realizes that Misery is dead. And it's like not even just her freak out when she's shaking the bed and screaming and says, if I die, you die, and it just escalates all the way up to that. Just alone, the shot where we hear it's him sleeping and we hear the door open and close, and then there's a cut to her standing in the dark. That cut by itself, I feel like, is the transition into horror movie. And then the rest of the scene that follows confirms that that's where we are, and then it goes from there. Um, but talking about how we get there through Paul's internalized thoughts in the book is something that you would think would be pretty hard to convey, because you've got stuff like when he has to burn his new book, and in the movie it's untitled. In the book, it's a story called Fast Cars, which if Goldman and Reiner were like, I have a hard time imagining this acclaimed author being this attached and thinking like his magnum opus is a book called Fast Cars, I guess I get it. And they went with the untitled route, but it's a great scene in the movie, no question. But the book goes through so many of Paul's different mindsets as this is happening. When it comes to the point that he has to burn this book, and he starts to kind of almost rationalize, like he talks himself into doing it and sort of rationalizing it. And then he kind of, because he starts in that place of, well, she doesn't know that I don't have another copy, and then she just lays out all the things she knows about him and the fact that she knows for a fact he would not have another copy. And then it's at that point he kind of rationalizes it and just kind of talks himself into it. But then as it gets closer to him actually burning it, he starts to remember the feelings and like the triumphs that come with writing. And then it's when he really realizes the love he has for this manuscript, and then that's when it kind of comes out where he's saying like, please don't make me do this. And I actually can't remember if the moment from the movie is also in the book, when she's starting to throw the lighter fluid on him to kind of motivate him. The way I remember it in the book is that he kind of had to get himself there. And that's something that I always found interesting, and it's something that's hard to convey when you can't read Paul's mind in a movie. But I'm basically saying this to put praise on what James Caan is doing here, because it is kind of it's been a popular sort of outlook for a while now that it's like everybody loves the Babe's performance, it's iconic, and she won her Oscar for it and all that, and that all of that and how big the part is and how unpredictable the part is might tend to overshadow what Caan is bringing to the movie also. But I feel like when you're watching the movie and you're really into it and invested, you can see the strengths of both the performances working together, and like the magic that was happening on that set as that was going on, and the way Caan can really only use expression to show those things that we see in great detail in the book of how Paul's feeling about it, and the way he can like rationalize it in his mind, and then it kind of turns into all the memories he had of writing it and all the turns that he found in the story, and coming to this conclusive piece that he really adores, and then having to kill it, like almost like sacrificing a child. And all of that you can just kind of see on his face as it happens. And the way we go into other things in the book, like his sort of his internal desire to kill her and how that's just continuously growing. But then there's also like this sort of internalized hopelessness that keeps setting in also, and the kind of back and forth of that, of this sort of fight or surrender kind of keeps, combating in his mind and going back and forth of which one he's going to try. And every time he tries to fight and it fails, he gets more helpless than the last time he was helpless, and just everything is growing and growing. And there's even the great moments in the book also when he starts to visualize feelings of like pain and hunger as a horse race, and like which one is more dominant at that particular time. And stuff when he becomes afraid of the typewriter because it looks like the typewriter's grinning at him with like missing teeth where the keys are missing. Stuff like that, like I said, is stuff that you can only really get out of the book. But there's plenty of terror as it is in Khan's performance, and you can see a lot of that when you're really looking at it. There's more points of desperation in the book that are pretty early on, like when at one point he has to like drink his own piss out of his hands. And when I say that, it happens a lot earlier than you would think. Like it sounds like one of those moments of desperation where it's like, oh, it was like maybe towards the end of his run he was getting as, rock bottom desperate, but it's like, no, it was actually pretty early he started drinking his own piss. And that's how bad it got very quickly and how quickly that it escalated. But something I want to talk about also about the concept of being trapped in one place with Annie. Annie, who is just a person. Like, you think of all the monsters and the scary things that King has created, and here you've just got this one person. This woman who is a nurse that is completely human. And everything that he's able to do with that. Now, I'm sure the diehard King fans are screaming at this point, Annie's cocaine. Annie's a representation of cocaine. She's an allegory for cocaine. Yeah, I know. But I guess I'm in a fortunate enough place that I can't really relate to that part of King and his life, but I get it. I acknowledge that it's there, and that was like an inspiration, and it's an interesting way to look at it. But looking at her as just like this sort of human monster that he's stuck with in this situation that can feel very, very real is the place that I really look at this story at the most, and where I can admire it the most. And the fact that not is she just, this human monster, but the fact that our protagonist, the person that is trapped, isn't just imprisoned, like, because he's in a place he can't get out of. The fact that his body is broken, and that she has the ability to make it more broken as it goes, and take power away from him physically, is something that just really feels... It just feels like such a trap. And it's like the fact that Annie's so unpredictable, she basically epitomizes or being trapped with Annie as a concept basically epitomizes that feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop, where anytime she seems like human or happy or like understanding, the worse she's gonna be when she comes back. And like when she starts saying that she loves him, it's like, so it's gonna be when she feels like she's at the peak of her emotions that seem positive, that's only gonna mean he's probably closer and closer to death the happier those happy moments get. And that's just... it's so bleak. It's like so incredibly bleak, but in this really great and effective way. And this, especially, there's a moment that I don't think is even touched on in the movie, that's a moment in the book that makes so much sense and makes it scarier, is that when she has those moments where she goes completely insane, and at one point, like, even, chopping his foot off, when she comes back and she's the happy Annie again, she genuinely seems to have no memory of when she was being psychotic. Like, they are two totally different personalities that aren't aware of the other one. And so which makes it impossible for her to be reasoned with. So, and to approach in some conversational way, because even if, like, the moment with the paper, when he tries to very calmly explain to her, well, it smudges and you don't want it smudged, and, like, it's this thing that you would think Annie would be perfectly okay with and understand, and it's this snapping moment. You can see the switch where she goes from one personality to the other over this one thing. So there's literally nothing that can be done. You cannot have a human interaction with this person. And even if you have one where she leaves the room happy, you're putting on your best performance, and you know it's not going to last, because she'll probably be one of the worst sides of her personality when she comes back, for whatever reason it could be set off. And what makes this especially interesting, though, when you think about how unreasonable she is, how you can't even speak to her, the fact that she is competent in so many ways, where there's the great sort of turning point in the middle here, when the way he puts it in the book is he uses the constant reader thing that he calls his fans very affectionately. And the idea of him explaining that Annie goes from constant reader to merciless editor, as she's talking about what should be in the book and what shouldn't be, and what works and what doesn't, and the fact that he's cheating to get out of things. And when she talks about going to... This is the book and the movie. It's a great moment in the book, and I love how much they capitalized on it in the movie and made it, like, one of her great scenes. Like, one of the great scenes of Kathy Bates' whole acting career, which is monumental already. And the fact that this was so early into her career, too. But this moment where she's talking about going to the serial movies as a kid and freaking out when they cheated, and basically explaining Deus Ex Machina, which he says explicitly in the book. And as she's going through this, even though it's clearly like another psychotic episode, she's perfectly laying out how much she understands storytelling, and good storytelling. It's basically the epitome of she's not wrong, when she's going on this whole tirade, because that's and what's great about this also is the fact that King, when you read the book, is writing out Misery's Return as an actual story. So he's like actually writing it, and he's writing it as Paul in this particular situation. And so, because while telling this story, King has trapped Paul in this corner, he's also put himself in that corner in regards to telling the story of Misery's Return in a way that doesn't... Because now you've introduced your audience to the concept of Deus Ex Machina, and now you can't use it. Or even, like, be in that area of using it. So, the fact that he and Paul both can't cheat their way out of this story is such an interesting exercise in writing, when you look at it that way. And the fact that when he has to write down in the story, when King is writing Paul trying to come up with an idea for Misery's Return that Annie will be satisfied with, this ultimate editor now, he has to basically explore the idea that he never likes like King himself never likes talking about, which is where ideas come from. And, like, when you're writing, where it all begins, essentially, and how you get to that point of coming up with an idea to getting to the finished product. And so, the way it plays out, where it kind of shows that ideas for writing essentially come from, like, a chain of thoughts. Where, like, you think of something, and then that makes you think of something else, and there's a chain reaction until you've got an idea, essentially. Or even, like, you'll just see something out in the wild and something will just spark. And it's like, he basically has to put all that into showing us Paul's process of having to come up with an idea. Not to mention the fact that Paul in the story is writing to save his life, or at least prolong his life. So, when you're looking at it from, like, a writing standpoint from a writer, it's really... it's, like, the most sadistic way possible to show an audience this is basically what that process feels like. while he also like under pressure. And it's like, especially from his standpoint of writing professionally, when you have like deadlines and people breathing down your neck and stuff like that, and basically just amplifies that, and that's what Annie is. And it's like, and like I said, just the twist though of like Annie being competent in regards to how stories are told is just throws such an interesting wrench into how stuck Paul is in this scenario. So I really, really love that about the character. You can tell that I think King has always said that Annie was like one of his favorite characters he ever wrote, and it becomes abundantly clear the more you read this, despite the fact that she's essentially his worst nightmare. That's probably part of the great appeal of it also. In talking about, the tension that's in the book, but the movie can really step it up and really portray cinematically, where editing's going to play a big part in this movie-wise as well, and that is the moments of suspense where Annie will leave and Paul breaks out of the room and moves around the house. And finds out little details here and there, whether it be like, where the drugs are, or what her backstory is, grabbing the knife, all that stuff. And I remember seeing this movie I will never forget seeing this movie for the first time. I had rented it from the video store, and I was still in my childhood bedroom at the time, and I was just glued to this movie in a way. I was still young enough that it was rare for me to kind of be fully 100% glued to movies. When you're younger, your attention span still kind of goes off. I will never forget how glued I was as a child to these scenes where Paul is out of the room, and we're cutting back to see where Annie is in the process of getting paper, and then her journey back, and then her walk up to the door, and he almost breaks the penguin, but then turns it the wrong way, and he has to get back in the room and lock it again, and just all of that is still and the fact that not only do I remember seeing that as a young child and being so sweating bullets, but no matter how many times I've seen the movie since, which is a lot, that never that's the suspense of those scenes where he's out of the room and has to get back before she comes in never loses. That tension never goes away, no matter how many times you see it. And that's just, and whether it be the editing or whatever. And that's another thing too, where it's like the movie made the choice to show us back and forth. Oh, this is where Annie is now. Oh, now she's here. Oh, now she's outside. She's walking up to the door. She drops the paper and has to pick it back up, giving him just a half more of a second. And it's so perfectly done. But the book does it in a different way that sounds like it would be the ideal way to do this. Like I said, this is where they both work, because as a movie, using visuals and editing and stuff like that, it makes perfect sense to show us where he is and where Annie is and build tension that way. In the book, because we never leave Paul's perspective, essentially, once he's in the house, we never know where Annie is when she leaves, or how far away she is, or when she'll be back, if it'll be 15 minutes, if it'll be an hour, if it'll be several hours. We never really know how much time we have to get back into the room and make it look like we never left. That is something that's also incredibly stressful and suspenseful, and works in its own way also. So that, I feel like, that whole sequence, those sequences, is a prime example of how both of these can work being told in slightly different ways. So that's how I feel about that. There's also details in here that didn't make it over to the movie that aren't completely necessary, but do just add these little turns, the idea of Annie's brother also being named Paul. I was trying to remember if we ever see that in the scrapbook in the movie, but I know there's a whole moment in the book where he freezes on it, and it freezes his blood inside him when he sees that, and all the things that could possibly mean, but we never really delve into because we don't have to. It's just another one of those things of how deep does this psychosis and obsession go that Annie has for Paul, but still, there's still plenty enough in the movie to add all of that feeling as it goes on, because the movie is also getting from one point to the next much quicker than the book is. So I guess while we're talking about these book to movie changes here that might seem small, there is one that is bigger. And it's the one I feel like you always sort of hear about, where every time, because I had already seen the movie several times before I ever actually read the book, but I had always heard one thing. There's always that person that pipes up and wants to tell you what probably the biggest change from book to movie was. So this is something that almost turned into like a game of telephone now. So here's the thing. One of the most famous scenes of the movie, if not the most famous scene of the movie, is the hobbling, where she puts the block between his legs and breaks his ankles with a sledgehammer. And that seems like the sort of worst kind of torture. And it's, like I said, the most famous scene in the movie, pretty much. She joked about it in her Oscar speech. It's a scene like everybody comes back to as this horrific moment in like horror movie history. And then you'll always have that person whose head pops up from the back of the crowd screaming at you, oh, in the book, she chopped something off. It was much worse in the book. Now, here's the thing. The reason I'm, like, zoning in on this is that what I had always heard was... And I swear, I don't think this is a false memory. I swear I heard this multiple times before I read the book. Somebody saying, oh, you thought it was so terrible when she, took a sledgehammer to his ankles in the movie. In the book, she chops his legs off. I swear I've heard multiple people say she chops his legs off in the book. So, that really is the main reason I was surprisingly underwhelmed when she chops one foot off and his thumb. Now, which is not fair to King or the book, because that is clearly horrific. And especially the way they describe it, where he says, when he's, like, watching this happen, and he's saying, like, his leg is moving, but it isn't, and it's, like, how, like, there was a moment where his foot was only attached by, like, a sliver of his calf, and the whole thing where it's, like, she uses, like, an electric knife to cut off his thumb, and she uses it as, like, there's the moment where she uses his thumb as a birthday candle, and I feel like that's one of those moments where it's vague enough, and Paul's in such a state at that point. The way I remember it is we can't quite tell if her using the thumb as a birthday candle is something that's really happening, or if it's something that's in, like, his drug-induced state. Honestly, I suppose it could be either. It feels a little over the top if, Annie actually did it, so maybe that's why my mind is remembering it as it might have been, like, a drug-induced dream that he had shortly after it happened. I can't remember exactly if the book's explicit on that or not. You have to forgive me, but, yeah, and the way that he describes how, when she's actually taking parts off of him, he describes it in the book as, she's exercising her editorial authority over his body. Like, she's literally editing his body the way she's editing his book. And that's pretty twisted. But yeah, so I don't really necessarily think the sledgehammer in the movie is that watered down of a version of what happens in the book. Like I said, losing an actual... And the way he describes how he's, like, having to adapt to that and how he can still feel it there and stuff like that is definitely eerie, and really adds to how he would have to recover once he's out of it. But yeah, it was just it seemed always so blown out of proportion by what I had heard. And it's like, it almost makes, like I was saying, I feel like it's people who hadn't read the book, and then, like, the people who had read the book had played a game of telephone with them, and that's how it came out was, oh, she chops both of his legs off, because that's a totally different climax if he would have neither leg. And it's like, just losing one foot does make it more believable the way he still is able to do what he does in the climax. So, there is that. And then you have stuff like, the way the seasons pass, where it does feel like he's prisoner forever in the book. Where it's like, in the movie we do see, like, snow melting, but then there'll be, other snow that happens, and it's usually in montage form. And so, I feel like I can't remember if the movie is explicit in exactly how long he was there. But I'm pretty sure in the book it's pretty close to a year. I feel like, if I'm not mistaken, where like we go through like the change, like summer comes through in the book. So he's there for a very very long time in the book, and you can really feel that, and that's something where a book is much more likely to feel epic in nature, versus a movie that has to feel sort of more condensed, but and also feels a bit more believable the more it's condensed, because especially since you have the element where they find the car pretty early in the movie, and that's a whole thing in the book where it's like he's debating with himself if the car got buried completely, and if it's like, waiting for the snow to melt before they find it, and doing that whole thing. In the movie, that's like one of the first things that happens is they find the car, and then it kind of goes from there, and that's where Buster really kind of gets to take off as a character in his investigation. So from that angle, they do take completely different approaches, but like I've been trying to express here, both work as telling it in the fashion of a book and then in a movie, and how your pacing has to change when you go from one to the other. And I feel like they still handle that well, the passage of time, regardless. But then we get stuff like the sort of aftermath stuff. Like we have, our big climax where this great moment that will never not be satisfying, when he concocts the plan to burn Misery's Return in order to get to her. And in the movie, we see it occur to him when after he sees Buster killed in front of him and he's laying in the cellar. The book is another place where it takes us to another whole other helpless place, where there's a whole night where he's prisoner in the cellar, and we get that vibe of when he's explaining it, when he's thinking it, and he's thinking about the rats and Annie being gone all day in case they come back for the cop that she killed. And so the way Paul describes it in his mind really gives you that feeling of, we can't stay in the cellar for a night. If we stay in the cellar for a night, we are going to go insane. We are going to scream until we can't scream anymore, if this is the case. And just really puts you in that place. We get these moments, these really eerie moments in the book when he's basically starting to accept his own death. And this kind of leads into the scene where he's going to confront Annie for the last time, too, where he's actually, like, making mental note of the things he's doing and basically saying, like, I'm doing all this for the last time. I'm hearing the sounds I'm hearing for the last time. Like, this is going to be the last time I hear, like, a floor creak or this thing or whatever. And that's just this really dark, dark place to be in. And I love that the book can really illustrate those thoughts as he goes through this. But in the movie, it's like this completely satisfying moment when we see exactly what his plan is and how it plays out. And then this sort of final confrontation. It does seem like the way he ends up killing Annie did always seem a bit anticlimactic in the movie. Because it is like, when she hits her head off the typewriter, it seems like a death. And it's like, oh, that's perfect and poetic that that's how she dies. And then she has the horror movie return, where there's one more moment, and then he hits her with the whatever that is, the very heavy pig statue. And then that's it, like one hit to the face, where it always gives you this vibe of, oh, is she gonna pop up one more time? How long are we gonna do this? And I suppose maybe that was intentional, given the way the book plays out, where not only does she come back several times, but it's almost even more anticlimactic in the book, where we learn much after the fact that she had escaped through the bedroom window, made it all the way to the barn, and was about to pick up the chainsaw to bring back to him, to kill him, when she just died in the barn. And the way that plays into our sort of expectations and our waiting for her to come back or make some kind of move ends up playing into this really interesting look into Paul's trauma once it's all over, which the movie did perfectly with one scene. This scene at the end, where I always thought it was sort of, when I saw it when I was younger, I always thought it was this sort of unnecessary, like, final horror moment, like, right to end the movie with, when he visualizes Annie in the restaurant. But once you read the book and you see how much it goes into the trauma factor and how he keeps having nightmares or visions of her reappearing, and how real that is for traumatized people who have been traumatized by a person. How you'll think like that person's always, even if you know that person's dead, they will like come out of the shadows or from behind a couch or something, and it makes that last scene in the movie make a lot more sense when you realize how trauma based it is. The movie makes it pretty clear, but like I said, I was younger at the time, so. But yeah, once you see just how it really lays out Paul's trauma after the fact in the epilogue of the book, that's something where it's almost, God, those last few pages are almost as scary as the whole rest of the story. Even after she's dead and he's just haunted by her, is just terrifying. So that all comes together really well. So, but then we have that great final moment in the book where he's like weeping because he's found writing again. And that's just, it's actually a pretty beautiful ending while also beautifully terrifying. So yeah, that's where I stand on this. So I can't even say there's like, a preference between one or the other. Like clearly, for like Dreamcatcher and Thinner, it was like the books were able to do things that the movie was never going to be able to do, and it almost seemed ill-advised to try to adapt them to the screen as closely as they did. But here, like I said, it's a pretty close adaptation, while also you can acknowledge that the changes they did make are pretty big, but for different reasons, because one had to work as a book and one had to work as a movie, and both of them I feel like just work perfectly as their own. So that's how I feel about this. So the next thing is going to be another straight-to-video thing. Like I said, we're going to continue with those. We're going to do 2 more of these King things. I'm kind of cramming to do one of them. And then we'll have another one of those, and then we'll do our franchise at the end, and we've got other stuff going on as we get into this second half of October. So until the next thing, I think that's it.